This week, major train line closures about to disrupt travel right across southeast Queensland, Brisbane's housing market tipped for another surge, and youth crime figures are falling, but the timing raises some important questions about what's actually driving that change. Hey, Adam here. Welcome back to the weekly update on everything happening across Greater Brisbane. This video is sponsored by two exceptional local businesses, YB Painting and Get Car Tech, and I'll tell you about the exclusive offers they have for viewers of the Brisbane Channel later in the video. But just quickly before we get started, if this is your first time watching one of these, or if you've noticed the format has changed slightly, this video is now the Greater Brisbane Overview. So I'll be covering the biggest stories affecting the whole region, and then I've got separate, more detailed videos for each LGA, Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Moreton Bay and the Redlands. If you're interested in what's happening in your local area, you can jump into those through the playlist linked at the end of this video and also through links in the description below. They can be accessed through the playlist and links before the videos go public over the next few days. Alright, let's get updated. First up, let's talk about transport, because there are some major disruptions coming that are going to affect a lot of people across southeast Queensland. From early April through to late April, there'll be significant track closures across multiple lines, including the Sunshine Coast, Caboolture, Redcliffe, Shorncliffe, Airport, Gold Coast and Beenleigh lines. And this isn't just routine maintenance, this is part of what's being described as a once-in-a-generation transformation of the rail network. A lot of this work ties into major projects like the Cross River Rail, upgrades to signalling systems, station improvements, and broader efforts to increase capacity across the network. There's also work underway to support faster and more frequent services in the future, particularly along the Gold Coast and Northern corridors. Now, in the short term, that does mean replacement buses, longer travel times, and in some cases, pretty significant disruption to regular commuting patterns. So if you rely on trains across those lines, it's definitely worth planning ahead and checking TransLink updates before you travel. But zooming out a bit, this is part of a much bigger shift in how the Southeast Queensland rail network is being prepared for future growth, especially in the lead up to 2032. And I'll be tracking it all here on the Brisbane Channel, so make sure you're subscribed so you can always stay in the loop. Now to housing, and this continues to be one of the biggest pressures across Greater Brisbane. A new forecast is tipping Brisbane house prices to rise by close to 20% over the next 2 years. That's a significant increase, especially considering how much prices have already risen over the past few years. And when you combine that with broader affordability data, it paints a pretty clear picture. In many suburbs, the income required to comfortably afford a home is now well beyond what the average household is earning. And we're also seeing a shift where areas that were traditionally more affordable, places like Ipswich and Logan, are becoming increasingly expensive as demand spreads outward. So the gap between incomes and housing costs continues to widen. The Australian Bureau of Statistics puts the average Australian wage at a bit over $81,000 a year, with the average full-time employee making less than $107,000. But according to CanStar, based on typical lending assumptions, estimates suggest a home buyer in Rocklea would need to be making $141,000 a year to afford repayments. And that's not taking insurance into account, with the area vulnerable to flooding. In other traditionally affordable suburbs like Acacia Ridge and Zillmere, you'd need to be making $151,000 and $164,000 respectively. In pricier suburbs, you'd need a substantially higher income, $246,000 a year for Greenslopes, $251,000 for Enoggera, and $386,000 for Robertson. Even in the Logan suburb of Woodridge, which was once accessible to people on lower incomes, you'd need to be earning $132,000 a year to pay off a mortgage, and that's not taking into account possible future interest rate hikes. And for anyone interested, there are 5 Brisbane suburbs where you'd need to be earning over $500,000 a year to make your mortgage repayments, with Tenerife in the lead. If you're thinking of buying there, you'd need to be making over $750,000 annually. These figures would vary depending on deposit size, interest rates, and lending criteria. Now, there are a few key drivers behind this. Population growth remains strong, demand is still high, and supply is struggling to keep up. And that supply issue links directly to the next story. One of the biggest constraints on both housing and infrastructure right now is the construction workforce. New projections suggest Queensland is facing a significant shortfall in construction workers in the lead up to the 2032 Olympics. At its peak, that shortfall could reach tens of thousands of workers as multiple major projects ramp up at the same time. So what that means in practice is fewer workers available for new housing, increased competition between projects, and upward pressure on costs and timelines. And this isn't just about Olympic venues. This affects residential construction, transport infrastructure, schools and hospitals, and pretty much every major build happening across the region. So when we talk about housing supply not keeping up, it's not just about approvals or land, it's also about whether there are enough workers to actually deliver those projects. Now, staying on construction and major projects, there's also been a lot of attention this week on the CFMEU inquiry, particularly in relation to the Cross River Rail. And this is something that comes up quite a bit in the comments on this channel, questions around delays, cost increases, and what's actually driving them. The inquiry is currently looking into the role and influence of the CFMEU across major projects in Queensland. And in recent hearings, Cross River Rail has been a key focus. Evidence presented has raised questions around workplace practices, project management decisions, and the extent of union influence on how work is carried out. Now, to be clear, this is an ongoing inquiry, so these are claims and evidence being examined, not final findings, but it does highlight something important. When you combine labour shortages, major project demand, and complex industrial arrangements, it creates an environment where costs can rise and timelines can be impacted significantly. And for a project like Cross River Rail, which is one of the largest infrastructure builds in Queensland history, that's something a lot of people are watching closely. It also feeds into the broader question of how large infrastructure projects are delivered and whether current systems are set up to deliver them as efficiently as possible. A quick shout out to channel sponsor YB Painting Services. They recently won 2 first and 3 second place awards in the Master Painters Australia Queensland Awards for 2025, and when you see their professionalism and the quality of their workmanship, it's no surprise. With fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on all their work, you can be sure there'll be no unpleasant surprises. Claim your 10% discount by scanning this QR code or the link in the video description. Now on cost of living, and specifically fuel prices. The ACCC has raised concerns about widely varying fuel prices across different locations, and in some cases prices rising just as fast or even faster than the underlying wholesale costs. One of the key triggers for this latest scrutiny has been the recent conflict in the Middle East. What's typically expected is that changes in global oil prices take around 1 to 2 weeks to fully flow through to prices at the bowser. But what's been observed recently is that prices at some service stations in Queensland rose almost immediately after those global price movements, which raises questions about whether some fuel may have been purchased earlier at lower wholesale prices and sold at significantly higher retail prices. And that's exactly what the ACCC is now looking into, trying to understand how pricing is being set and whether those increases are being passed on in a way that reflects actual costs. For drivers, this is something you might already be noticing. There can be quite large differences between suburbs and even between service stations meters away from each other. So this is one of those situations where it's definitely worth shopping around, checking fuel apps, and keeping an eye on local price cycles. Because depending on where and when you fill up, the difference can be pretty noticeable. And while you may be paying more for fuel, at least you can save money on quality car tech. Channel sponsor Get Car Tech can upgrade your car with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto functionality. They specialize in custom vehicle-specific CarPlay solutions, so everything looks factory-fitted and works seamlessly. Conveniently located in Tingalpa and backed by a 5-star Google rating, they'll match the right system to your car and your needs. Prices start from just $590 fully installed. Mention the Brisbane Channel for $100 off any of their services. Scan this QR code now to get a quote for your vehicle or visit getcartech.com. Now briefly on state finances, because this one can get complicated pretty quickly, but it does have real implications. A new GST distribution has been announced, with Queensland set to receive a higher allocation in the upcoming financial year, around $18.4 billion, which is an increase compared to last year. But the Queensland Treasurer is unhappy with the allocation. So what's the story? A big part of it comes down to how the system works. GST revenue is distributed between the states based on their relative ability to raise their own income. And in Queensland's case, a key factor is coal royalties. When coal prices are high, Queensland earns more from royalties, and that can reduce the amount of GST it receives. But when those royalties fall, as they have more recently, the GST allocation increases to help balance that out. So that's part of why Queensland is seeing a higher share this year. But the argument from the Queensland government is that despite this increase, the state is still not receiving what it considers a fair share overall. Their position is that over time, Queensland has effectively been penalised for having strong resource revenue in the past, and that the system doesn't fully reflect current conditions or future growth pressures. On the other side, the system is designed to ensure that states with less revenue capacity are supported, so there's always a balancing act between different states' interests. So this is one of those ongoing federal state funding debates that doesn't have a simple answer. But in practical terms, it does influence how much funding is available for infrastructure, services, and major projects across Queensland. Now, I want to spend a bit of time on public safety because this has been one of the biggest and most talked about issues across Queensland in recent months. Firstly, the introduction of the Public Child Sex Offender Register under what's known as Daniel's Law. In its first 10 weeks, the register has seen around 205,000 visits, with tens of thousands of location searches. So from a usage perspective, this is clearly something that the community is engaging with. There have also been enforcement outcomes, including 9 offenders found to have had access to children, including 2 who are now facing charges for not fulfilling their reporting obligations, and the other 7 currently being investigated. However, there is an ongoing discussion around how these types of registers should operate. Supporters point to increased transparency and awareness, while others raise concerns around issues like vigilantism, privacy, and long-term rehabilitation. Now, alongside that, we've also had new national data released on youth crime, and this is where the picture becomes more complex. The latest figures show that youth offending in Queensland has declined over the 2024-25 financial year, down around 9%, with the overall rate also falling. So at a headline level, the trend is downward. The current state government has pointed to these figures as evidence that their policies are working. But when you look more closely at the timing, the downward trend appears to have started before those policies were introduced, with the first tranche of adult time, adult crime laws introduced in late December 2024. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean those policies aren't having an effect, but it does make it difficult to attribute the entire decline to them alone at this stage, particularly when the data shows youth offending in Queensland has generally trended downward over the past decade, with a temporary increase after a COVID-era low before the downward trend resumed more recently. And there's another layer to this as well. A number of youth justice and criminology experts have raised concerns that while tougher laws and increased detention can reduce offending in the short term, as seen in studies both in Australia and internationally, those same approaches can, in some cases, lead to higher rates of reoffending over the longer term, particularly if rehabilitation and support aren't effective. So there's an ongoing debate here between short-term reductions and long-term outcomes. And it's also worth keeping in mind that even when overall numbers are trending down, that doesn't always reflect people's day-to-day experience, especially in areas where incidents may still be more concentrated. And just quickly, if you've been finding these updates helpful and you'd like to support the channel, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can support through Buy Me a Coffee or become a channel member here on YouTube, which also gets you access to extra content. There's absolutely no pressure, but it really does help support the time that goes into researching and putting these together each week. And of course, giving the video a thumbs up doesn't cost anything. So overall this week, you've got major transport disruptions on the way, continued pressure on housing affordability, labour shortages affecting construction and project delivery, ongoing cost of living concerns, and a more complex picture emerging around crime and public safety. Now, as I mentioned at the start, this is just the overview of what's happening across Greater Brisbane. Here's what you can expect in each LGA-specific video in this week's set. In Brisbane, there's a major push toward higher density housing around key centres, controversy around the naming of the new Glasshouse Theatre, and a property sale that really highlights just how extreme the market still is right now. In Ipswich, a major new steel mill could play a role in Olympic infrastructure, more housing is on the way for vulnerable residents, and there's a significant update in the long-running Swanbank odour issue. In Logan, we're looking at new community infrastructure, health services, and what's happening at a local level during what's been a bit of a quiet week. In Moreton Bay, there's an Olympic-linked precinct that could unlock hundreds of new homes, major transport upgrades moving forward, and the infrastructure being put in place to support future growth. And in the Redlands, plans for a new indoor sports facility are progressing, there's debate around koala protections, and a look at one of the last remaining affordable suburbs in Greater Brisbane. You can jump into whichever one is most relevant to you, they're linked in the video description, or watch through the full set to get the complete picture across Greater Brisbane. See you there.